Margaret Foster adjusted the lapel of her charcoal blazer as she stepped into the executive conference room, expecting a quiet farewell, or maybe a handshake from the regional board. After all, tomorrow was supposed to be her last day after 31 years at Great Plains Trust and Savings in Kansas City. She had even brought homemade pecan bars for the IT staff. Retirement was just one sunrise away. But waiting inside was Evan Carver, the 41-year-old CEO, with a polished Wall Street grin and a crisp folder in his hand. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't even say good morning. Instead, he held out the letter and said, "This is effective immediately. Your role has been dissolved due to strategic restructuring." Margaret's hand hovered before she took the paper, scanning it once. Her name, her title, termination date today. She blinked. No protest, no raised voice. Just one question, quiet and steady. "That's final." Evan nodded, avoiding her eyes. "We appreciate your service, Margaret." "No, you don't," she thought. "You just don't want to pay the $1.8 million pension I've earned." Evan was all numbers and optics, new branding, rapid hires, slick marketing about innovation. He never once asked how the bank's infrastructure actually worked. Never cared to know she was the one who had designed the system that processed nearly $14 billion in transactions every day. Margaret looked at the letter again, then slid it into her leather portfolio. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She walked toward the door. Paused. Her badge hovered over the scanner. Beep. The light flashed green for the last time. She didn't look back. No grand exit. No parting words. Just the steady hum of the HVAC and the click of her heels along the carpeted hallway she'd walked for 3 decades. Somewhere deep in the code of the system she'd built, something subtle began to shift. The morning after her termination, Margaret sat at her kitchen table stirring coffee long gone cold. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, falling across her leather-bound notebook, its pages worn at the corners filled with the first hand-drawn diagrams of the system that now powered one of the largest regional banks in America. Back then, it had no official name, just security layers, modular pathways, and her own late-night notes from years of building line by line, safeguard by safeguard from the ground up. The infrastructure, the fail-safes, the encrypted core. All of it was hers. Not legally, perhaps, but in every functional and moral sense. The system didn't just run because she wrote the code. It ran because it trusted her. She remembered when that trust had first been tested 16 years ago. Margaret uncovered irregularities buried deep in the transaction logs, quiet anomalies pointing toward an internal scheme to siphon funds. When she brought her findings to the executive committee, they thanked her, and then buried the matter. Within a week, she was removed from oversight roles, left off strategy calls, and labeled hard to work with. That was the first time she understood they wanted her to build, not to question. But she never stopped questioning. Years later, the board asked her to sign off on quarterly reports bloated with inflated asset values. A harmless adjustment, they called it. Just one signature. It would have guaranteed a foundation scholarship for her son, a full ride to a top university in Chicago. She refused. The offer evaporated. Her son attended a state school instead, graduating with student loans. Margaret quietly helped him repay over the years. Ethics had a cost. Margaret paid it, silently, painfully, without regret. It was during that season she created Sentinel, a contingency, a choice, never a threat. If she retired on her own terms, the system would transition seamlessly. But if she was forced out, Sentinel would shield itself from anyone who tried to control it unethically. It was never designed as a weapon, it was a boundary. A final safeguard written in code. Margaret never spoke of it. Not from fear of consequences, but from belief that people, when it truly mattered, would choose integrity. Evan Carver had never read the blueprint. None of them had. Now the system's hum was subtly different. Quiet, but undeniable. A shift. A slow tightening. A silent defense. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked out the kitchen window and murmured to no one, "I warned them." Ethics matter in architecture. Evan Carver was the kind of leader who knew how to flash a perfect grin for the annual report. 41. Crisp suit. Gold cufflinks. Raised on a steady diet of investor luncheons and leadership podcasts, Evan Carver knew how to charm a crowd. The Kansas City press loved him. Visionary, agile, disruptor. He scheduled meetings like performances complete with staged lighting in the conference center and catered coffee carts. He called them fireside sinks, and he referred to staff layoffs as energy pivots. Internally, he held Margaret Foster up as the cornerstone of Great Plains Trust and Savings' digital legacy. At the bank's 30th anniversary gala last spring, he'd handed her a commemorative plaque and called her the architect of trust. 3 weeks later, in a Slack message to his deputy CTO, he referred to her as the relic. She wasn't meant to see it, but she did. She didn't confront him. She just saved the screenshot. Margaret knew exactly what Evan was doing. He wanted space. Space for his hires. Space for his credit. The architecture she had spent decades refining was no longer an asset in his eyes. It was an obstacle. Too intricate for shortcuts. Too principled for manipulation. So he repackaged it. Every technical meeting became a stage for Evan to host, flanked by his innovation leads, bright, ambitious hires, with polished speech patterns and LinkedIn-perfect resumes. If stories of quiet strength and unwavering integrity inspire you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter is coming soon, and you won't want to miss the powerful journeys still waiting to be told. But none of them had deep system knowledge. Margaret found herself in the second row of meetings she used to lead. When she voiced concerns about reckless code deployments, Evan would nod politely and move on. "We'll circle back on that, Margaret." They never did. The bitterest moment came during the annual compliance review. Margaret had submitted a detailed report titled Sentinel Protocol Ethical Exit Safeguards. Inside was a section outlining Sentinel's purpose and operational conditions. She flagged it for executive review. Evan didn't read it. The document tracker showed zero activity. When she followed up, his assistant replied with a one-line email. "We've decided not to prioritize legacy protocol reviews at this time." That word legacy landed like a slap. Margaret wasn't asking for applause, but after 31 years of carrying the bank's digital infrastructure, she'd expected to be treated as more than a wire to be cut. She never yelled. She never retaliated. She simply remembered. But the anger settled in her chest like a stone. Cold, quiet, unmovable. Evan Carver hadn't just fired her. He had erased her. And he didn't know, wouldn't know, until it was too late that she'd left a safeguard buried deep in the very system he dismissed. At 9:01 a.m., exactly 29 minutes after Margaret Foster scanned her badge for the last time at Great Plains Trust and Savings, the first alert flashed on the system dashboard in the bank's Wichita branch. Transaction authentication failed. Node KS07. Error code 8102. At first, it looked like a small branch hiccup. The on-site IT tech ran diagnostics, rebooted the rack, and tried again. Same error. Core validation loop not recognized. Within 5 minutes, similar pings appeared across Topeka Lawrence and Overland Park. ATMs displayed authorization timeout. Mobile transfers froze mid-process. Customers refreshed their banking apps. Some tried again. Others called the central IT control room at headquarters. A junior tech flagged the incident and escalated it to Tier 2 support. By 9:12 a.m., the Tier 2 team attempted to access the root authentication system to check the live gateway logs. Access denied. Insufficient credentials. They tried again, this time using the backup admin key issued from Evan's office. Still denied. Signature mismatch. Lead systems engineer Dana Henson stared at the blinking red bar. "That's not right. We've used this key for 3 quarters straight." Evan, coffee in hand and scrolling through his morning emails, was paged to the control room. What's going on? His tone was still casual. We're seeing handshake failures across 3 states and we can't override them, Dana said. The system's asking for something called— She hesitated. Sentinel signature root. Evan froze. Sentinel. Dana nodded. Does that mean anything to you? He didn't answer. Pull up the system design documents. The team opened the archive. The master documentation file appeared, but it was unreadable. Encrypted. Dana typed rapidly, attempting a bypass. A message appeared. Document secured by M. Foster. Last modified August 3, 2007. The room fell silent. No one's touched this file in over a decade, Dana Henson whispered. They stared at the screen. Every attempt to drill deeper into the archive hit another wall. Each barrier traced back to one source: Margaret Foster, her ID, her digital signature, her long-retired administrator protocols. By 9:26 a.m., 7 more branches across Kansas and Missouri reported the same glitches. Evan Carver's phone buzzed. Incoming call, Treasury Compliance Desk. He didn't answer. Not yet. For the first time that morning, his jaw tightened. This wasn't a glitch. It was a lock. And the one person with the key had walked out exactly 29 minutes ago. By 9:47 a.m., the glitch had escalated into a blackout. From Omaha to St. Louis, ATM screens across the Great Plains Trust and Savings Network froze simultaneously. Each displayed the same blunt, impersonal message. Service unavailable. Please contact your branch. Only the branches weren't answering either. Inside the bank's mobile app, user logins spun endlessly before timing out. Wire transfers hung mid-process. Pending mortgage approvals stalled. Internal dashboards showed incomplete data. Authentication systems stopped responding entirely. At 10:04 a.m., lines began forming outside branches in Wichita and Columbia. Local news stations caught the growing crowds. Great Plains Bank system down, statewide outage. Hashtags began trending. Social media filled with confusion and frustration. Some wondered if it was a cyber attack. Others feared a cash shortage. Many just wanted to know if they could pay their rent that day. On the 15th floor of headquarters, Evan stood with both hands pressed flat on the glass conference table, eyes locked on the live incident feed. Tell me this is temporary, he said sharply. Dana, now leading the crisis call, hesitated. The system hasn't just failed, Evan. It's rejecting every override we've thrown at it. This is intentional behavior. It's protocol-driven. Evan exhaled slowly. So we're locked out. At the root level? Yes. He turned toward the bank's general counsel, who had joined the emergency call via video. Reach out to Margaret Foster. Now. Offer reinstatement, whatever it takes. Offer a bonus. I don't care. Just get her to unlock this. The legal team nodded and placed the call. At 10:21 a.m., they got an answer, but not from Margaret. It was the HR director's assistant. We can't authorize any communication regarding internal systems. Ms. Foster is no longer an employee of Great Plains Trust and Savings. Her credentials have been formally revoked. She no longer has access or permission to engage. They tried again, this time from Evan Carver's direct office line. No answer. He paced the boardroom, jaw tight. They don't get it, he muttered. She wants control. That's what this is. She's making a point. Dana Henson shook her head. I don't think she's making anything, Evan. She left, and the system is doing exactly what she built it to do. Evan looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the street below, where camera crews were beginning to gather outside the headquarters tower. The system might have been offline, but the bank was very much in the spotlight, under fire and unprepared. And the one woman who could stop the unraveling had walked out less than an hour ago. By 11:05 a.m., the boardroom no longer rang with orders. It hummed with unease. Half-finished coffees sat cold. Jackets were draped over chair backs. Evan had stopped pacing. He stood still, staring at the freshly printed contract on the table in front of him. Reinstatement, retroactive employment, immediate compensation package, double her original retirement amount. If we offer this to Margaret now, Evan said, forcing an even tone, and she signs, we bring her back on paper. Once she's technically re-employed, she can override the lock. No one disagreed. Everyone wanted to believe it could be that simple. One mistake, one fix. A price to pay, but still salvageable. The legal team rushed the process. The contract was updated, reviewed, and notarized. Copies were printed, scanned, and prepared for secure delivery both by encrypted email and hand courier. The plan was set. All that remained was for Margaret Foster to agree, and sent out via secure email with a courier-delivered hard copy as backup. By 11:31 a.m., Margaret Foster received it. She was sitting in her living room in Kansas City barefoot with a cup of chamomile tea in hand. Outside her window, the world was loud market tickers, tumbling phone lines, buzzing news headlines flashing red across financial networks. Inside, everything was still. She opened the file, scanned the language, read every line twice. Her name was there. So was her title. Her reinstated salary and benefits. Her welcome back. It even bore Evan Carver's digital signature. Then came a knock at the door, the courier carrying the same contract in a sealed envelope. She thanked him quietly. Then she dialed the number on the final page. Evan answered himself. Margaret. Thank you for calling. Look, we know things weren't handled well this morning, but this contract restores everything. Just sign it and we'll set the override. We'll make this right. Margaret was silent for a long moment before replying. I can't sign this. What? Why not? Because it's invalid. What are you talking about? It's legal, it's signed. It's not about legality, Evan. It's about timing. Sentinel isn't just a lock. It's a condition. It only responds to an override initiated by an active authorized employee at the moment of activation. She paused. I was fired at 8:32 a.m. You ended that authorization. Evan's voice cracked. But if we bring you back? You can't bring me back to a moment that's already passed. He said nothing. I warned you, she said softly. In the white paper. In the protocol notes. But no one read them. Margaret ended the call. She didn't slam the phone. She didn't cry. She simply leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and whispered, This isn't revenge. It's architecture. And miles away, in a glass-walled boardroom filled with blinking monitors and anxious faces, Evan Carver finally understood what no dollar amount could undo. They had lost the key the moment they let go of the hands that built the lock. By 12:18 p.m. It was no longer a disruption, it was a full-scale collapse. Over 84% of Great Plains Trust and Savings front-end digital services were offline. Teller interfaces cycled endlessly through authentication errors. ATM networks across Kansas and Missouri stayed frozen. Internal operations slowed to a crawl as staff attempted to process transactions by hand, something many hadn't done in years. Then came the first market tremor. At 12:23 p.m., Great Plains stock slipped below the $42 line for the first time in nearly a decade. It didn't stop. Within 15 minutes, the stock had fallen 18.4%, triggering an emergency halt on the trading floor. Evan Carver was in his office when the CFO walked in, pale and whispering, We've lost over $1.4 billion in market cap in under an hour. Evan barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the red arrows cascading down the digital display beside the bank's name. Below it, a small line of text blinked Core Control Override. Request denied. Architect verification failed. Every attempt to bypass Sentinel had been rejected. They'd tried cloned access keys, biometric forgeries, even an emergency override script Margaret had written herself years ago. None of it worked. Sentinel is live, Dana Henson said flatly. Untouchable. Even Margaret can't override it now. Why, Evan demanded. She doesn't have employee status. Her clearance was revoked at 8:32 a.m. Sentinel doesn't recognize her anymore. It's a closed door. Then break it down, Evan snapped. Dana looked exhausted. We can't. The root logic runs on Margaret's original framework. Half the architecture is invisible without her private keys. Then rebuild it. From scratch. Silence. A younger engineer, Chris Patel, shifted nervously. We've run the scenario. To recreate her system clean code, new verification layers, secure testing, 6 to 8 months minimum. Conservatively. Evan's voice was tight. How much? 4 to 500 million. No one moved. At 12:51 p.m., a private call was made to the chairman of the board. By 1:04 p.m., Evan was summoned to the top-floor boardroom. 7 of 9 directors were present, faces drawn, voices clipped. The head of the audit committee didn't bother with pleasantries. Mr. T. Carver. This board is initiating a formal inquiry into executive negligence, reckless termination of critical personnel, and the resulting financial harm to shareholders. Termination of critical personnel and the resulting financial damage to shareholders. Effective immediately, your decision-making authority is suspended. Evan Carver opened his mouth, but nothing came out. No defense, no spin, no clever strategy. Just the cold weight of consequence. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't a glitch. It was the collapse of a structure with no architect left to guide it. And the irony cut deeper than any headline. They had fired the only person who understood the foundation. Now at 2:05 p.m., while media headlines blared about stock plunges and banking chaos, Margaret Foster sat quietly at her kitchen table. She logged into a private email account she hadn't touched in years, clean, encrypted, and unlinked to any employer. She opened a blank message. Subject: public clarification. Great Plains Sentinel events. She wrote without anger, without bitterness, only clarity. To all concerned parties and system stakeholders, I have not tampered with, sabotaged, or otherwise interfered with Great Plains' trust and saving system since my termination earlier today. The protocol currently active is one I authored over a decade ago, a passive contingency titled Sentinel, created solely to protect the bank's digital integrity. Its only trigger is the unethical removal of its original architect prior to a confirmed retirement transition. Once triggered, it secures the system from unauthorized succession. It is not an attack. It is not malware. It is, in every sense, the system choosing not to trust those who violated the ethical contract it was built upon. I do not wish harm to the institution. I have only withdrawn the one thing I truly owned, my trust. She paused, then attached a single PDF and email dated August 14, 2008, addressed to the bank's former board. If our systems ever outpace our ethics, I will have failed in my duty as an architect. I have written a safeguard not for myself, but for the integrity of the structure. Should this board choose speed over stewardship, retaliation will not be necessary. The system will simply stop listening. Margaret hit send. By 2:16 p.m., her statement reached 3 internal mailing lists and leaked to a major cybersecurity forum. By 2:37 p.m., it appeared on financial tech blogs, then was tweeted by 2 former engineers with the caption, "She warned them." They laughed. The system remembered. Younger developers began sharing Sentinel's defining line across forums and feeds. I only withdrew the one thing I truly owned, my trust. It spread quickly, not as a scandal, but as a quiet kind of anthem. Some called Margaret Foster a whistleblower, others a systems visionary. She didn't respond to interview requests. She didn't appear on camera. Instead, she closed her laptop, stepped onto her back porch in Kansas City, and watched the late summer sky shift from gold to deep blue. Inside, the world buzzed with speculation, stock analysts, former colleagues, digital rights advocates, all weighing in. But Margaret wasn't chasing justice anymore. She had built it into the blueprint. They had ignored the warning, fired the architect, and triggered the defense she had designed not out of revenge, but out of principle. Now the system was doing what she had always done, standing quietly holding the line, waiting for the right people to return. By 3:42 p.m., Great Plains Trust and Savings was no longer facing a system outage. It was facing a crisis of trust, and trust is harder to reboot than code. Customers had waited in lines for hours watching digital transfers fail, growing anxious as local news confirmed it wasn't an outside attack, but an internal safeguard. That phrase, internal safeguard, ignited something. By 4:00 p.m., public sentiment had shifted. What began as anger toward a glitchy bank turned into doubt in its leadership. And when Margaret's statement began circulating in consumer advocacy groups, the shift became an exodus. If their own architect didn't trust them, one viral post read, "Why should we?" At 4:25 p.m., competitor Plains Federal rolled out an onboarding campaign, "Stability you can see. Systems you can trust." By 5:04 p.m., 42% of Great Plains' premier clients had begun account closures or asset transfers. Silence gripped the executive suite. Evan Carver was no longer at the head of the table. At 4:37 p.m., the board voted to suspend him indefinitely pending an investigation into gross mismanagement and concealed operational risks. He left without a word, just one last glance at the monitors, each flashing "access denied." The most devastating blow didn't come from a tech audit. It came from legal. At 5:14 p.m., a junior counsel reviewing system documentation found a footnote, "Copyright C. 2008 Foster Systems LLC, U.S. Patent Application 4721 and 16B, filed August 14, 2008. There it was, the entire Sentinel framework patented and privately owned. The layered encryption, conditional deployment, and behavior-triggered protocols had been patented more than a decade earlier under a private LLC wholly owned by Margaret Foster. Great Plains Trust and Savings hadn't just lost the architect, they'd never owned the house. A call went out to outside legal counsel. The board sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Every version of the system running on Margaret's framework since 2008 had been operating under a licensed structure not proprietary and without a valid agreement. By firing her, they'd unknowingly voided their own access privileges under the license's moral clause. No lawsuit from Margaret, no public threat, just structure law and the quiet force of long-prepared truth. The collapse wasn't loud or explosive. It spread inward like hairline fractures in glass invisible until the pressure snapped it apart. And the one name whispered in every hallway, every Slack thread, every late afternoon emergency call was the same. Margaret Foster, the woman they'd called a relic, had built something timeless. By the time the Sunday headlines broke the story, Margaret was already in her garden, trimming rosemary and lavender with steady hands. She didn't watch the coverage. She didn't read financial blogs or listen to the talking heads calling her a corporate martyr, a systems rebel, or a whistleblower. None of those fit. She hadn't fought anyone. She hadn't leaked secrets or staged a confrontation. She had simply walked away and let the blueprint speak for itself. And in her silence, the world started listening. Life moved slower now. She woke with the sun-brewed coffee without checking her phone and found joy in small things, the perfect bloom of a camellia, the wind through cedar branches, the hum of bees. Her son called more often. Old colleagues sent quiet apologies, but Margaret didn't need closure. What she'd always wanted was integrity, and at last, the system she'd built had honored it. At 9:12 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday, a small package arrived on her porch. No press, no fanfare, just a black envelope and a solid brass plaque inside Chief Architect Systems that protect their makers' planes, Federal Technologies. No contracts, no conditions, just a simple engraving on the back. "We don't need you to save us. We just want to build what you once believed was possible." She held the plaque for a long moment. Not smiling, not weeping, just still. There was no satisfaction in watching Great Plains Trust and Savings unravel. No sense of revenge in their public embarrassment, their hasty resignations, or their whispered settlement talks. That part had never mattered. What mattered was that the structure had endured. She had written her truth in logic, encoded her values into the very framework of the system. And when they stripped her title, they had unknowingly triggered the lines of code that demanded respect lines they had never taken the time to read. Some called it revenge. Margaret Foster knew better. Revenge is reactive, messy, and fueled by fire. Her design had been cool, deliberate, inevitable. It was never about vengeance. It was about defense. About building a world where ethics weren't optional, where foundations held firm even when the people above them faltered. As she mounted the brass plaque beside the weathered gate in her Kansas City garden, a warm breeze moved through the rosemary and lavender. She inhaled deeply, the air tinged with rain-soaked soil. She didn't miss the boardroom. She didn't miss the politics, the endless performance of leadership meetings. But sometimes, she missed the quiet hum of servers running exactly as they should. Not for their function, but for what they represented: stability, integrity, trust. She glanced at the plaque once more and whispered, "I didn't design it to punish them. I designed it to protect the system from people like them." And with that, she turned back toward the house. Not to rebuild the past, but to quietly design whatever came next. In a world where quiet strength so often goes unnoticed, Margaret Foster's story is a reminder that true power doesn't shout. It's built into the foundation. She hadn't sought revenge. She had stood for principle. And the system she created had spoken for her in the clearest way possible. If her calm resilience and unwavering integrity moved you, don't let this story end here. I've lived long enough to know that titles can be taken, but integrity is something no one can strip from you unless you hand it over. I didn't walk away from that boardroom in Kansas City to get even. I walked away to prove to myself more than anyone else that the values you build into your work outlast the people who try to rewrite them. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of my story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment I refused to sign away my principles, or the quiet satisfaction of knowing the system I built held the line without me? Share your thoughts in the comments, not just for me, but for others who might be standing where I once stood, wondering if doing the right thing is worth the cost. I can tell you, it is. If my story reminds you of a time you stood your ground, tell it. Someone else needs to hear it. And remember this: success fades, money moves, but the foundation you build, whether in a system, a business, or a life, will speak for you long after you've left the room. Let it speak with honor.